I live on the outskirts of Moscow, in one of those old Soviet-era apartment buildings that dot the landscape like relics of a time long past. It's not the most picturesque place, but it's home. The walls are thick, the windows slightly askew, and the radiators clang to life with a cacophony that fills the cold winter nights. It's a place of solitude, a place where each of us lives our own isolated life, barely brushing against one another. It was on one of these nights, deep in the heart of January, when Moscow is more night than day and the snow blankets everything in a deceptive calm, that my story begins. I had just returned from a grueling 12-hour shift at the factory. My body was weary, my mind fogged with the kind of fatigue that makes everything seem a little off-kilter. As I trudged through the freshly fallen snow towards my apartment, the cold air bit at my cheeks, a harsh reminder of the season's indifference. I noticed something odd as I reached my floor. There was a shadow, fleeting and quick, that darted across the dimly lit hallway. It was too quick to make out any details, too unexpected to give it much thought. I chalked it up to the tricks the mind plays when exhaustion takes hold, and I fumbled with my keys at the door. Once inside, the warmth of my apartment welcomed me like an old friend. I shrugged off my coat and boots, letting the worries of the day and the strange occurrence in the hallway slip from my mind. I was home, and that was all that mattered. Over the next few weeks, life continued as usual, or as usual as life can be when you work long hours and live alone. But something had shifted, almost imperceptibly. At night, I'd hear sounds, shuffling, muffled shouts, from the apartment next door. It wasn't loud enough to be disturbing, not really, but it was unusual. I knew a young woman lived there. We had exchanged nods and smiles in passing, but never really spoken. She seemed quiet, reserved, the kind of person who preferred to keep to themselves. I considered knocking on her door, just to check if everything was okay, but in Moscow, you learn to mind your own business. People have their secrets, their private lives, and it's not always wise to intrude. So I did nothing, telling myself it was probably nothing, just the usual noises of an old building settling into the cold. Then came that night in late February when everything changed. I arrived home to find the street outside our building bathed in the flashing lights of police cars. An ambulance was parked haphazardly by the curb, its doors open, a grim beacon in the darkness. My heart raced as I pushed through the small crowd that had gathered in the lobby. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, their faces drawn and pale. The police were everywhere, their presence a stark contrast to the usual quiet of our building. I caught bits and pieces of their conversation. Words like murder and next door floated through the air, chilling me to the bone. It was her apartment, the young woman who lived next door to me. Something had happened, something terrible. An officer, seeing my confused and concerned expression, approached. "You live here?" he asked, his voice firm. "Yes, next door to her," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He studied me for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "It's a bad scene in there. Looks like a break-in gone wrong, but we're still investigating. You didn't hear anything unusual tonight?" I thought back, trying to remember. There had been noises, yes, but nothing that had seemed alarming at the time. "Just the usual sounds," I said, my mind racing. "Nothing that stood out." The officer nodded, jotting something down in his notebook. "If you think of anything else, let us know. And keep your door locked, just to be safe." I nodded, my mind numb with shock. As I entered my apartment, the weight of what had happened next door settled over me like a heavy cloak. A woman was dead, murdered in her own home, right next to where I lived, and I had heard nothing that could help. In the days that followed, the police presence became a constant feature in our building. Detectives came and went, their faces grim and focused. I learned that the woman's name had been Anna, that she had been in her late 20s, and that she had moved to Moscow from a smaller town in search of work. Her life, so full of potential, had been brutally cut short. The investigation revealed unsettling details. The door to Anna's apartment had not been forced. Staring to the other corner of my lonely room, I put the keys from Anna's apartment to my pocket.